Hey, good afternoon, Lynda Lester. And even though some of the listeners will be hearing this in the morning, it is a lovely afternoon, and I am thrilled that we have Lynda with us today. Lynda Lester is probably the person I go to for any question I would have about areas of philosophy. And in particular, Lynda and I have been looking at the same philosopher for several years, Lynda for many years, and has really understood the workings of particular philosophers. But today, we're going to talk about Lynda's background a little bit, and then also we're going to launch into the covering one of India's most famous philosophers, and that's Sri Aurobindo. But first, Lynda Lester, could you tell us a little bit about what you did in Boulder, Colorado for many years? NCAR?
Yeah, sure, Diane. NCAR stands for the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And it's a national laboratory where they study all aspects of the geosciences, the earth, the air, the oceans, the biosphere, and to determine how it affects the atmosphere and the climate and the weather. And the particular division that I was working in was the supercomputing division. So, and scientists all over the world would use these supercomputers to do their research. And they'd run all these complicated equations in fluid dynamics and so forth and model the climate. And so my job was to be a writer-editor and publish a newsletter and a magazine and various web publications that would help the scientists to use the supercomputers.
The reason why I asked you that was because you deal with big, wide, vast entities and concepts. And to me, that's kind of what you need when you delve into philosophy. So I mentioned the name Sri Aurobindo. Could you tell us who is Sri Aurobindo?
Sri Aurobindo, that's a vast question indeed. So let's get into it. In a nutshell, Sri Aurobindo was a great spiritual leader of the 20th century who integrated the spiritual wisdom of the East with the material wisdom of the West. Okay? Yes. So I was reading a book the other day called Consciousness-Based Psychology, which is founded on Sri Aurobindo's work. Wow. And the authors of this book, they say that Sri Aurobindo offers an entirely new worldview that includes a new framework for psychology, a new cosmology, a new theory of evolution, and detailed maps of consciousness. And they say that his work represents a paradigm shift. That's the biggest contribution to spiritual thought in the last 2,000 years. Okay, that's what they say.
Yeah.
So that's a sneak preview of Sri Aurobindo, right? And it's quite a claim. But if we look into his life, we begin to realize he was not your normal spiritual leader, right? He was quite an atypical yogi.
What set him apart?
Well, for one thing, have you ever heard of the word polymath? Do you know what that means?
I don't.
A polymath is someone who knows a great deal about many, many subjects. So Sri Aurobindo was a polymath, and he wrote about culture, art, poetry, politics, history, psychology, metaphysics, spirituality, and he was a master of the English language, but he was also proficient in French, German, Italian, Latin, and Greek. And later he picked up a few more languages: Sanskrit, Hindi, Bengali, Gujarati, Marathi, and Tamil. How can you,
yes, that? Yes. Oh my God.
It's incredible. He was nominated twice for the Nobel Prize in Literature and once for peace.
Uh-huh.
So you can see from all that he was quite brilliant. And I'm mentioning all this because I think it's really interesting and it helps, to establish his credibility. So, just looking at his life a little bit, quick bio sketch. He was born in India in 1872, but he grew up in England, so he was well versed in the Western mindset. That's kind of interesting. And he studied at Cambridge University in London. And when he went back to India, he studied India's ancient spiritual teachings, such as, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and so forth. And he worked for a time in civil service and academia, at which point he entered politics and became one of the original revolutionary leaders of India's struggle for independence against the British, right? So, and this was at the beginning of the 1900s, way before Gandhi.
Yeah.
If you're
Can
following
you tell us more about that?
Well, let me see.
Was he jailed for any work?
He was jailed for his political work because, well, he was a writer and an editor, and he was writing these flaming editorials about, raising people's consciousness up to, resist the British colonial rule. And the British thought he was the most dangerous man in India. They were scared to death of him. And so they threw him in jail for a year. Yeah, they did. They threw him in jail for a year. And actually, I should go back a minute. That was after. So he's working really hard on politics, and he's going from city to city on the train, and people are cheering him because he's a national hero and all that. And one fateful day, he started thinking that yoga might give him some extra power for this political work, because there's power in yoga. And do you know what happened next? Have you heard that story about what happened?
I haven't, no.
So he met with a guru who sat him down and told him how to do yoga. He told him how to silence his mind. That's the classic goal of meditation.
Yes.
And, what do you know? In 3 hours, he did it. He silenced his mind. And in 3 days, it was permanent. And he was engulfed in this vast, profound experience that the Buddhists call nirvana, which he never lost. Although soon afterwards it merged into other spiritual realizations as well. So he had this, and then he went out and he was doing all his political work and giving speeches and writing editorials. And that's when the British got him and threw him in jail. So what happened when he was in jail? He was in solitary confinement, and he made a huge discovery. He discovered levels of an overhead consciousness that had not been mapped out in previous spiritual practices, and which he thought could bridge the enormous gulf between the spiritual heights, and life here on earth. So when he got out of jail, he left politics to devote himself to an intense spiritual discipline to follow up on this discovery. And he worked on that for the rest of his life. For 40 more years.
Yes. So. And was he still active throughout his life, or did he go into like a stage of inner study, and rather than his activity his political activity came to kind of a halt, didn't it? After
he withdrew from politics, although he never was completely isolated. He met with several politicians over the years. He threw all of, eventually an ashram developed around him. And when World War II hit, he put all the ashram, he sent money and ashram resources to help the Allies against the Germans. And later, when there was a proposal, it was called the Cripps proposal to give home rule to India under British sovereignty, he wrote a response to that and advised them to do it, and they didn't take his advice. So the horrible split happened, and he gave a radio address to the nation on India's Independence Day. So he was always kind of working behind the scenes.
Sure.
but not in front of the scenes. So, yeah.
Could you elaborate just a bit more on the time that he was spending in jail and how his own consciousness evolved? And you mentioned that he found different levels of consciousness.
Right. So, okay, so here's the thing. It was very different from previous spiritualities because you may know that many of them have seen this world as a place of suffering or sin,
Yes.
an unreal illusion,
Yes.
Maya. You may have heard of that.
Oh, yes.
And they say that, this world is a state that's so fallen and incorrigible that the final goal in one version or another, depending on your religion, is to get out, to pass from physical existence into a spiritual afterlife that will be much better. Go to heaven, stop reincarnating, head for nirvana, leave the world behind. Okay, but Sri Aurobindo discovered in jail and in his whole orientation from when he started politics onward, he said in his view the world was made for the delight of being, the beauty of being, the majesty of a sublime existence. And he thought that life on earth was not an unfortunate accident, but a miracle moving towards its own expression. And here's the key. He says that's happening through evolution. According to Sri Aurobindo, evolution is not random, and this all relates to the overhead levels. I'll get to that in a sec. According to Sri Aurobindo, evolution is not random, it has a goal. And what it is the gradual development of physical forms that increasingly manifest higher and more powerful modes of consciousness. Wow. So life is the first step, and that's plants and animals. And mind is the second step, and who's that? That's us. That's humans. But Sri Aurobindo says that evolution is about to take a third step with a consciousness that's greater than mind, and Sri Aurobindo calls it the supermind or the supramental consciousness. So
can you tell us more about the supermind?
Yeah, this is where it gets very interesting. So Sri Aurobindo says that the supermind is a stupendous power, and this is what he discovered, glimpsed in jail, and this is what he worked on for the rest of his life. He says it's an irresistible harmony, a compelling force of truth and beauty. But what's even more significant is that it's the bridge between unmanifest reality and the material universe. So get it? It's the missing link. It's the interface between the infinite and the finite. So it holds inside itself that supreme oneness, which is the goal of all the world religions, but it also holds within itself all the marvelous qualities of nature and the infinite diversity of manifestation. So it's an integral consciousness. And that's why Sri Aurobindo believed it could integrate spirit and matter, or, you could say unite spirit and heaven and earth. And he said that its complete realization would manifest a life of light, bliss, freedom, immortality here on earth in the material world. Okay, so here's where it starts getting relating to Sri Aurobindo's own individual practice. Yogis and mystics of the past have glimpsed that consciousness, but they couldn't stabilize it in themselves because there was as yet no evolved part of human nature that could hold it. Just fry your brain.
Yeah.
Be a crispy critter. So Sri Aurobindo worked to evolve his own human nature, his body, his life, and his mind, so that he could hold this vast supramental consciousness. And in doing that, he developed what he called an integral yoga that could help others to develop and evolve that capability as well, training. Yeah. Because, if one person accomplishes something, that means others can potentially do it too, like.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I'll give you an example. Like for centuries, people were trying to run the mile in 4 minutes, but nobody could. It was impossible. It can't be done. But then we all know what happened in 1954, right?
Yes.
Maybe we don't. Roger Bannister ran the 4-minute mile, and within months, people were doing it all over the world. So you could say maybe that Sri Aurobindo was an early adopter of the supermind. And he mapped out the various intermediate states of consciousness that lie between human mind and supermind so that we could know them, recognize them, and take them one step at a time. Kind of like a ladder, graduated level, a stairway to heaven.
Right. No, that's, I mean, this is pretty amazing, Lynda. That
Yeah,
one person
right.
is, I mean, it's almost inhuman.
It definitely, Diane, it's superhuman or maybe post-human.
Exactly.
It's,
Post-human. I think that's
it's
good.
it's and there's a book that's written about Sri Aurobindo called Beyond the Human Species by George Van Breckham. It really does go beyond the human species. And actually the work he did means that this supramental consciousness that he was working with will become attainable in a growing number of individuals around the world, at first only by a few, but eventually in a universal collective way, and that will potentially mean a new species on the earth. You know?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is something that the evolutionists, I don't think that they've quite gotten into and supported. They're very good at like the animals and plants and things of that nature, but human evolution, that's a step in the right direction. Lynda, I really appreciate the time you've spent with us today. And there's one more figure who is extremely important in integral yoga. And I hate to ask you this on the radio, but I hope that you will be able to come back and speak to us about Mira Alfassa, also known as the mother and the collaborator of Sri Aurobindo. And so if we could have like the same type of program where you just actually brought together not only the highlights, but really the tenets of his thought and philosophy. So we so appreciate having you today. And thank you. And I'm going to get your answer off the air about whether or not you would be interested in also speaking about the mother.
Okay, thank you, Diane. It's really been fun. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and